Just want to make sure that it's actually working before I get started. Okay, it looks like we're up and running. Awesome. Good. So I'm so glad to be back again. It's been a while since I've been in my group, and I'm really excited to kick off the year. I know I'm like a month behind in terms of the New Year stuff, but I'm back. I'm glad to be back with you guys because I have a bunch of things lined up for my weekly live stream. We've got some good topics in the works, and I welcome your input. Actually, if there's anything in particular that you guys want to hear about, you can put a post or a question and just say, this would be a topic I'd love to hear more about, and I'll add that to the list. Today, we're going to talk about passive aggressive behavior. And this is something that's super common and really tricky and insidious and difficult to put your finger on. And it's extremely common. I hear this all the time. It's like, what do I do when this happens? And there's something that you're picking up on, and it's how do you get traction and how do you know how to respond if somebody's not being above board? And it usually comes down to passive aggressive behavior. And sometimes it's really hard to identify what that actually is. So today I want to tackle this. What is passive aggressive behavior? Now, this is good for you if you are passive aggressive yourself or if your spouse has a problem with being passive aggressive. Either way, this will be helpful. So I'm going to just share a little bit about what it is, the definitions of it, how that shows up, why it's so damaging, why it happens, and what to do about it, how to think about it, and how to understand it so that you can better sidestep it if you see it, so that you don't get triggered by it and pulled in, because that can be such a triggering thing, and people get pulled into an old pattern or dynamic and reacting before they even realize they're doing it. Or you can call it out, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to talk about what exactly is passive aggressive behavior. To be really clear, I think we all kind of intuitively know is like it doesn't feel good, it feels bad, but it's not direct. But it's sort of exactly in the middle between passive and aggressive. So passive behavior is where you can't really say no to anybody. You avoid conflict at all costs, so you don't say anything. You feel like a victim a lot of times, and others take advantage of you, and you're just not going to be proactive in handling the problem. So you're just going to be silent most of the time. That's what passivity is. And then aggressiveness is where you're overtly criticizing or attacking or lashing out. You can be physically aggressive or verbally abusive, or just really criticizing somebody's character, picking on them, acting in anger, or deliberately hurting them. That's what aggression is. And then passive aggressive, both like extreme forms and mild forms fall under, it is essentially in the middle where you're not being direct, you're not being overtly aggressive, but you are being aggressive, but you're just doing it in an underhanded way. So this could be like, that you're angry, and you're denying it. Or it could be that you don't even know you're angry and it's coming out sideways because you're lacking the self-awareness. So you can't express it honestly and directly if you don't even know what you're feeling. You could be thinking about revenge a lot. You could be using sarcasm a lot. You can be acting unhappy to make a point, sulking, pouting, non-verbally indicating your dissatisfaction without being direct. And it might happen when you're aware that you're resentful and you're trying to get them back, but in a subtle way because you don't want to be the bad guy. That's what passive aggressive is. And I'm going to get into some examples here. So the top comments that I hear for passive aggressive behavior is you might hear somebody saying, fine, like fine. If you ask somebody what's wrong and they say nothing, but you can see that there obviously is something wrong, and they're going to say, no, I'm fine, or I'm not mad. Or you ask your spouse a question and they say, whatever. That's a passive aggressive comment. It's like you're pretending like you don't care, but obviously you do. Comments like, I hope it's worth it, which is just an example of a sarcastic comment where you're almost sort of sticking it to them a little bit. Another example would be if you say to your spouse, well, if you can just find it in your heart to prioritize the family, and that would be really great if you could finish this project. It's like it's a request, but you're slipping in a little bit of an underhanded dig. Okay, that's an example of passive aggressive. Another way that this shows up is it can be that you're deliberately sabotaging an agreement, or you're deliberately sabotaging what you know your spouse wants. So it could be being late chronically. It could be saying that you're going to do something and then not doing it. Agreeing to something that you're not actually on board with, and then you're resentful about it. So then you make sure that it doesn't happen, because why should you have to do it anyway? But you're not actually communicating that you didn't want to do it or taking ownership for your choice. And that can be sabotaging. Sabotaging can also look like, I know that my spouse is trying to get something accomplished right now, or she's focused on something else, or he's focused on something else, and I'm going to behave in ways that are going to make it so that they can't get done what they're supposed to be getting done. That would be an example of passive aggressive. Another thing is like procrastinating and leading into saying you're going to do something and then not doing it, or you do it, but you just wait and wait and wait, and you force the other person to have to check up, or you force the other person to have to ask, and to create a little undercurrent of anxiety. And then if they react, then you can point the finger at them. That's passive aggressive as well. There's also things like hostile behavior. That could be no eye contact. When you're really mad at somebody, but you don't want to say it, you won't look at them when they're talking to you, or you might just give them monosyllabic answers, or you give them the outright silent treatment, like completely ignore the person. And that's really hardcore passive aggressive. I would say that's aggressive. But because you're not actually saying anything mean or critical, you can maybe feel like you're not actually doing anything wrong because you're not saying anything. Another way that you can be passive aggressive is to give a backhanded compliment. I'm trying to see if I have some examples of that. Yeah, I didn't actually write those down, but like I'll give an example. If your spouse does something and they have a history of not doing that thing, you might be like, "Oh wow, I didn't expect that. Well done." Or, "Oh, look at you being on time." Right? It's a compliment, but you're sort of getting a dig in, like, "Oh, you're usually not on time, and I'm not going to let you forget that, even though you did this thing right this time." So that'd be an example of a backhanded compliment. And maybe you have some examples, and I'd love to hear yours as well. Or if you have a question about something, and I forgot to mention this, please put it in the comments below, and I'm going to do a live Q&A at the end of this if anybody's on live. And if you are listening to this not live, I'll also go through and answer your questions later. If you have an example and you're wondering, is this passive aggressive, I'll let you know. And the reason why passive aggressive behavior is so hard to deal with and damaging to a marriage is because it creates mistrust. It's insidious. You can't put your finger on it. And when you try to speak to it, if the person isn't really being above board, they can dismiss you. They can say, "Oh, I was just kidding. You're paranoid. You're misperceiving. You're misunderstanding me." And it just feels really bad. It might even be something you're not aware of, but you walk away from the interaction, you're like, "That didn't feel good." You're feeling disconnected and you don't know why. And that creates mistrust. You can't really feel emotionally connected or trusting of your spouse if you feel like that's going on. So there's what's going on with the passive aggressive behavior that is damaging is that there's essentially what's going on is there's a subtext. You can't deal with it directly because it's a subtext. They might even deny that that's what you're hearing. And so it's a way of avoiding ownership and proper communication. People can get away with not actually communicating their feelings or their requests. They can avoid vulnerability. And if we're not willing to be vulnerable and we're not allowing ourselves to be honored, then there's no way that you can actually have a positive connection with your spouse, right? It's like a lose-lose. You're not going to get what you want if you're being passive aggressive because you're not even being clear enough for them to honor you or give them the chance to honor you. So then they're going to be failing and you're going to not be getting what you want. So it's really a lose-lose situation. It's basically a way of being dishonest. You're not being honest if you're being passive aggressive. Also, there's an incongruence between the verbal and the physical energy that you're bringing to the conversation or to the interaction. So you might say you're fine with something, but your body language is showing that you're not. Or your words are saying one thing, but your energy, and people can feel your energy, could be super judgmental, it could be super unhappy, but you're trying to either hide that or you do want it to show. It could be either one. You do want it to show, but you're still not going to be above board with it because then you could be called out and then you could be the problem, right? nonverbal communication is so powerful. It's responsible for like 95% of what we do. And that's why I always say it doesn't really matter how you, like the words that you use, if the energy behind it isn't congruent with what you're doing. If you're trying to use respectful communication, but you're not feeling respectful, then they're still going to hear what you're feeling, even though you're using the right words. And that's hard when you're really trying your best to get over something that you know is just your stuff. If you know, like, I'm having a reaction to something, but I don't want to act in the old ways, so I'm going to say what I should be saying, and you're making an effort and they still hear that subtext, that can be tricky because you're trying to do something different and you don't want to be heard in the old ways. So I have compassion for people that are doing the work, but that there's still that pull of passive aggressive behavior. So I want to be clear that this can be something that people are doing on purpose and they know they're doing it, or it could be very unconscious. And it's not something that, reflects ill intentions on the person's part. So that's a really subjective thing. And if you're wondering about that, let me know and we can explore that, because a lot of it has to do with the context, I think. So why does this happen? Why are people passive aggressive when it really isn't working, right? It doesn't work. It only causes problems and fights, and it erodes trust. It creates emotional disconnection and hard feelings. But the bottom line is that there are some valid reasons why this happens. It's not the way to go, but at least if we can understand why it's happening, then we have a better chance of being able to do something different. So the first thing to recognize is that most people are passive aggressive because they're afraid of speaking the truth. They might be people pleasing. They might have been raised to believe that they shouldn't say anything, or they shouldn't, have a need or a request, or they shouldn't feel the way that they feel. They could have been chronically invalidated their entire childhood. So they're assuming that they're not going to be heard, so they're not going to say anything. And they're essentially afraid. And it could be that you're people pleasing too. Like, I don't want to rock the boat, so I'm just gonna keep it to myself. I'm gonna be passive for a long time. But then eventually resentment builds, you're not using your voice, and then it comes out sideways. Inevitably, it will come out sideways. Always, I tell people this. The other thing that contributes to people being passive aggressive is that they don't know how to speak the truth. They might want to, but they don't know how. And then they're like afraid it will come out wrong if they're trying to be direct. So then they end up doing it the passive aggressive way, just because it's either more familiar or because it's just the only way that they can even think of, communicating their feelings. They also might not know the difference between honest truth telling and the kind of truth telling where you're crossing the boundary. So let me explain. So speaking the truth, how I look at speaking the truth is sharing about yourself. Sharing about yourself. What are your feelings? What does it mean to you? What meaning are you making out of something? What is your thought process? And what are your desires? What is your ask? That's honesty, if you can communicate those things. But if you're truth telling about the other person and what you think they're doing, or what you think their intentions are, or what you think is going on, and you're giving that meaning without asking, that's not really honest, because you're crossing over into their jurisdiction and talking about them to them. And so if people get that mixed up, and they don't really know the difference between what real truth telling is in a relationship, then that will lead to passive aggressive behavior as well. And then finally, it could be that you just really want to get back at the person. There might be some injuries that have happened. There might have been some betrayals, and you thought you were over it. You tried to be over it, but it's still there. You resent them and you want to make them feel bad, and it could be conscious, it could be not conscious, but on some level, you want them to feel bad, and you're not going to put your own intentions out there, because like I said, you want to avoid looking like you're the problem. And so you will let them know, and you will try to get them back and make them pay. And you're at risk of being passive aggressive if you have a need to please, if you are noticing resentment, if you're feeling really judgmental but you're not saying anything, or if you are really wanting to be direct but you just don't really know how to do that, and or if you're not really aware of your own feelings, you're at very high risk of being passive aggressive. So just keep that in mind. Do a personal inventory and look at that, and if you have those risk factors, then it's important to figure out what your truth is and then learn the right ways to communicate those proactively from a place of connection, so that the habit of passive aggressive behavior doesn't like come upon you when you're not thinking, right? Because if you're not proactive, when you're feeling good, then when you're not feeling good and you're in the old story again in your mind, and you're looking at things through the lenses of the past, and you get triggered, the habit is just going to win. It always does. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And we're gonna, and also I want to get into some other things that you can do if you're passive aggressive. I'm gonna split this up. If you're passive aggressive, here are some things that you can do, and then I'm gonna get into if your spouse is passive aggressive. You've got to be able to share honestly and directly while staying in your lane. Okay, now that means you have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to take the risk that if you say your truth, that you can withstand their judgment if they judge you, that you'll be okay even if they don't like it, or that you're risking them dismissing you. You're risking if their reaction doesn't meet your approval. You have to be willing to be vulnerable to be able to learn how to to communicate without criticism. You want to be able to communicate without criticism, and that requires vulnerability. So if that's something you struggle with, then that's important to look at and figure out, okay, how do I get my power back by actually surrendering a certain kind of control over the outcome and somebody else's response or reaction. This can be learned, and it's really important to know that no matter how long you've been doing it the old way, you can always learn to do it in a new way. And if you're triggered or overwhelmed, and you notice that you have intentions and you have clarity on this, and let's say you're listening to this and you're like, I totally get that. I know that I do this. I know why I do this. I have insight, but I just can't stop doing it. Sometimes when I get triggered or overwhelmed, then you have to do some inner work and the belief change work at the subconscious level. There has to be healing. That's going to be a prerequisite to learning it and actually being able to implement it systematically, consistently, and to be able to sustain that as your new way of being. Because you can't continue to behave in a way that your deeper subconscious beliefs do not support. You might be able to do it temporarily in a crisis situation when you're really hypervigilant, but as soon as you're not totally conscious, then that's going to kick back in again. So you got to do your relief work if this is a problem ongoing for you. And that's a hard truth for a lot of people, because they think, well, if I have the tools, that's going to be enough. But that's not going to be enough if the inner strength isn't there. So you have to be willing to say, what work can I do to get strong? How can I get some really strong beliefs about myself and about love and relationships? How can I heal the trauma from my past so that I can actually execute healthy communication with my spouse in spite of my fears, in spite of what happened before, in spite of what I already know about my spouse? All of that. That's so important. Now, if your spouse is passive aggressive, you can call it out lovingly, and you recognize they're doing it. This takes a lot of strength and awareness, and you have to be very conscious and present to be able to do this, where you call it out lovingly. It seems like something's bothering you. What are you thinking or feeling? So if they give you, like, let's say, a backhanded compliment, they get a dig in on you and it hurts, and you like want to react and go into defending yourself or chewing them out, the best ideal thing is to just recognize it as, this person is being passive aggressive because they might not know how to say what they're really feeling to me, or maybe they're scared. So I'm just going to make it safe. Call it out lovingly. What's on your mind? What are you thinking and feeling? You still have to hold a boundary on how they communicate to you, because you're not inviting them to verbally abuse you. You're just inviting them to share from their perceptions and their story and their interpretation and their feelings what's going on, so that you can be connected. Oh, I understand. Okay. And maybe there's some repair that needs to be made. One example of how you could do this is, if, let's say, they start to get a little bit heated and they're like, well, and then they launch in with a you statement instead of communicating in a healthy way. You can say, look, I can't engage that comment if they get like critical. I can't engage that comment. Or if they drop a little passive aggressive barb your way, or they engage in sarcasm, you could say, I'm not going to engage that, but I do care about how you feel. Just tell me honestly with an I statement. Tell me with an I statement how you feel. And if that doesn't work, you have to draw a hard line on what kinds of things that you are going to not respond to. And then you have to stick to it. and just decide I'm never going to bite when he or she says these things to me. So if there's a pattern and your spouse tends to say certain things to you, you might have to really get clear on this and write this down. These are the things that in the last month my spouse has said to me that I think are passive aggressive, that really hurt my feelings. And to be able to know, or things that you think that, a lot of people have like recurring arguments. If it's something that you think they're going to do again in the future, you anticipate it happening again, be clear on what that is and be ready for it. It's not about avoiding it. It's about saying, bring it on, and I'm going to be ready for it. And when it comes, I'm going to stick to my disengagement. And you can decide what that looks like. You can let them know ahead of time. Like, when you say these things, I'm going to give you one reminder to just tell me how you feel honestly in a nice way. And if that doesn't work, then I'm going to walk away. And you just don't bite. Okay. And you have to remember, it's so much easier to say this than to do this. You have to remember that it's not yours, so you don't want to pick it up. So not only are they crossing a line if they are communicating in an aggressive way to you, if it goes from passive aggressive to aggressive, but you're actually violating a boundary by picking up something that's not yours. If someone else is having a problem, it's their responsibility as a grown up to be able to tell you what that is in a way that is not aggressive. And they might be working on that, right? That's why you could be giving them some grace and saying, can you tell me how you're thinking and feeling with an I statement, and remind them. But if they can't do that, and they drop it anyway, and they're just going to insist and they're getting really aggressive with you, you just have to remember, this isn't mine and I'm not picking it up. And it might seem mean, especially if you feel like they want you to engage and their feelings are hurt and maybe they're guilt tripping you, because a lot of times passive aggressive behavior is a guilt trip. You have to remember that it's actually a loving thing to do to not pick up what they're dropping, because then they will learn to grow and to communicate in a way that will actually work. And you can let them know you're on their team in doing that, but you can't engage. You can't, they're not going to grow in the ways that will promote a healthy relationship. Um, you'll be paying the price for their acting out behavior, and there won't be any direct line between their behavior and their own natural consequence of that, which is disconnection. And it's not, and I'm not saying that you should do it to punish, and it's not to be to teach anybody a lesson. It's just to hold the boundary for yourself, because that's what's healthy. And that's literally the only way. Like, you cannot fix it for somebody else. You just cannot. Because, and I know a lot of people try, if they could, they would, right? They absolutely would if they could. And you probably know by now that it doesn't work and you can't. And so by picking up something that's not yours, you're just playing into that myth, and you're doing a disservice to not only that person, but the relationship itself. So boundary work is a really big part of not being passive aggressive. And then on a final note, I just want to say, have compassion for yourselves. If you're the one that's doing passive aggressive behavior and you're, being honest and taking a hard look at yourself, I commend you for doing that. It's not easy. It's not easy to look at yourself and say, shoot, I do this. And it can bring up shame. It can bring up embarrassment. It can bring up guilt and remorse. But just give yourself some compassion, because you only do as well as you know how to do until you know better. And once you know better, then you can do better. So make that commitment. People do the best they can, and even a misguided attempt at communicating might have something important underneath it to shine the light on. So have compassion for your spouse too. If they're trying to communicate something to you and they're not doing it perfectly, it's misguided, it came out wrong, try to have compassion for them as well and give them an opportunity, demonstrate a safe environment to be able to speak their truth, so that you can create that culture in your relationship that passive aggressive behavior is not necessary. Because if you speak the truth in an above board loving way, then I will hear you. And so there's no need to do all of that. And that's something that you can take responsibility for doing, and having compassion. If you can get past defensiveness when they're bringing something to you and look at the positive intentions underneath, which is usually to be heard. Most everybody's just fighting to be heard on some level or to be connected. And even if they're doing it in a childlike way, you'll see how much more you have in common than you realize, and you can find your areas of overlap where your values really align, that you really do want you do both want the same thing, you do both want to connect with each other, and that you can find a way to get on the same team. So that's my advice for you guys today on passive aggressive behavior. I'm going to check to see if anybody has any questions about this. Awesome. Okay, cool. So, James, how do we change that behavior? I just gave some examples of things you could do. If you're still on, let me know if that made sense. Essentially, just to kind of recap, what you want to do if it's you that's being passive aggressive, you have to really get in touch with what your feelings are, and you have to learn how to communicate that using an I statement, not blaming, not criticizing, and to be risking being vulnerable to actually say, this is how I feel about something, rather than letting it come out sideways, because that's just only going to hurt you by hurting the connection of the relationship. And then if it's your spouse that's passive aggressive, what you're going to do is call it out lovingly, give them an opportunity to do it the right way. And if that doesn't work, then you have to just draw a boundary and don't pick it up if it's not yours. Don't engage, don't bite. And it might be uncomfortable at first, but that's really providing an opportunity for growth. Let's see. Greta wrote, it's so hard to ask what he's feeling when I'm used to hearing so much criticism, judgment, and anger. Totally. And you have every right to request that get communicated to you without that. You can say, I really want to hear you, but I'm not able to hear it when you're criticizing me or judging me, or when you're coming at me with that much anger. And so let's talk about it later. Can we talk about it later? Let's cool off and I will hear you later. You absolutely don't have to take that. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you feel strong enough to gently prompt them and remind them, and they can simmer down and then you can hear them, fantastic. But if not, then you have to draw a line and say, I can't hear you like this. It does take a lot of strength. You're right, Greta. It really does. It takes a lot of strength. But you don't have to bite. And that's super, super powerful. And when you can tap into that power, even once or twice, and you feel it and you can maintain it, then that strength allows you to be so much more generous. That boundary allows you to be so much more generous. So find that first. And that's going to help with everything. And I am going to be doing another live stream on boundaries at some point, because it keeps coming up in all of this stuff. But if you guys have any other questions about examples of this in your relationship, if you're not sure if this is what's happening or you're struggling with this, go ahead and put your questions here underneath the live stream, and I will respond to them. And then if you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive, if you're looking for help in your relationship, if you want to talk to me, you can book a call at monikahoyt.com/talk. And you'll be going right to my calendar, and you can book yourself in. And essentially that phone call is to look at, what are the dynamics in your relationship? How is it showing up in your specific situation? What's the context? And what the next steps would be for you if this is something that is a chronic, pervasive problem that you've been trying to work on and you just haven't been able to make any headway. Or if you recognize, I see that this is what's happening, but I also know that the boundary work and the belief change work and the self-awareness piece and all these things that are going into being able to stop being passive aggressive, if that's something that you recognize you need help with, then I would suggest booking a call with me. That's going to be far more effective than what I can answer in the live stream. monikahoyt.com/talk. And with that, I'm going to say thanks for joining. It was so good to see you guys. On Friday, I'm going to have another live stream with Ned and Kelly. And that is already posted in the group under announcements. Check that out. I hope you guys can make it. It's going to be at 10 a.m. Central Time this Friday. And then every Tuesday at 10 a.m., I will be having another live stream. So if you have a topic you want tackled, go ahead and put a post in here and just let me know. And hopefully people will piggyback on that. And I might create more polls to kind of see, what are the topics that most people are interested in, so that I can serve you guys at a higher level. All right. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys on Friday.